All right, so I'm going to share my screen and we are going to get going. So first off, would not be appropriate, would be appropriate and inappropriate not to mention our sponsors, not just for the Big Bang, but folks that help underwrite the programs that we provide at the Institute. And included in those, most notable one for those of you interested in legal support, DLA Piper will be hosting legal office hours in April. We're grateful to the UCD School of Medicine and Veterinary Medicine for funding those prizes, and Power School, and all of our other sponsors make a really huge difference. Just quickly on upcoming events and activities, and this QR code should be scannable on your mobile device. So next week, I will be teaching the workshop on market, business, and technology validation. And then following week, we'll be telling your story, talking about how you share your narrative. And then on February 5th, we'll be talking about defining a sustainable enterprise. And then in April, as we move towards the Big Bang final presentations, I'll deliver a detailed session on delivering your pitch. And a couple of deadlines to note, Little Bang is coming up. That competition is almost full. Unfortunately, we do have a cap on that. So if you are interested in the Little Bang, I urge you to get your application in as soon as possible. Every year, Little Bang fills up. We have to put people on the wait list. Sometimes you get off the wait list, sometimes you don't. So strongly urge you to do that. And then the Big Bang competition deadline, you got a little bit more time, March 3rd. Okay, so our objectives for today is to talk a little bit about what does it take to commit to moving forward with your idea, with your venture, with your technology. Think about a new venture as a series of experiments. We'll talk about that a little bit. The first deliverable, right, that you're working on is your pitch, whether that pitch is an elevator pitch or a 10-slide pitch deck. That ultimately is your first prototype. And then I want to spend a couple minutes talking about recognizing the importance of understanding the problem you're solving. Sometimes we can tend to go all the way to the solution and to our technology without really thinking about what problem are we solving and who are we solving it for. And then this idea of stating your idea, your venture, your technology in terms of a problem, a solution, and a value proposition. Okay, so I'm going to do just a couple of quick polls. This is Poll Everywhere, so you can scan the QR code up on the right. Or if you want, you can go to, with any device, pollev.com and enter in Joe D, because that's me. And oh dear, and we'll be able to take your response. So the question is, why are you participating in the Big Bang workshops? You want to pursue commercialization of an idea you're working on, better understand your career path, embrace a growth mindset and build your knowledge base, or all of the above. I'll give you all a moment to find Poll Everywhere, and I will do it too. So I too can say why I'm doing it. And if you have the app, by the way, you can just join with Jody. And you don't need to register or anything.
Joe, I apologize. Can you explain how to do that again? I don't see on the screen like what we need.
Okay, hold
Okay,
on. We will get back to it. So go to pollev, pollev.com,
got it.
and then enter in Jody, Joed.
Thank you.
And you're not seeing the QR code in the top right of your screen?
No,
Interesting.
I'm looking now.
I am, and I can scan it too. That's odd.
Can everybody else see it?
Yeah. And now my slides are
Yep. No,
sliding.
I don't see the cure either.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to move on, just given limited time. We, of course, did a dry run. I see a couple of you have responded, several now. Want to pursue commercialization of an idea I'm working on or better understand your possible career path. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the first element. Interesting. Well, Poll Everywhere has just barfed. So that would explain why you all are having trouble. Okay, so we're back. So one of the fundamental questions you're asking yourself as an entrepreneur is the idea you're considering, right, any good, right? And we think about it in this relatively simple management consulting 2x2 matrix, right? The vertical is the idea looks bad at the bottom and looks good at the top. And then the horizontal axis is the reality, right? The idea either is bad, far left, or is good, far right, right? So in the world of 2x2s, of course, you always want to be top right. It looks good, it is good, everybody's a genius, right? When you look at it initially, this looks great, and you go and execute it, and it is great, right? Similarly, if it looks bad, I don't think this is a really good idea, and it turns out it is bad, that's a duh, right? Nobody's putting any energy into it. The real challenge is when something looks good, right? The top left, but isn't, right? And these are, typically a type 1 error, right? You're investing time and energy, your precious time and energy in a bad idea that at first glance looked good. And then on the bottom right, type 2 errors, right? You reject a good idea because it looked bad at first glance, but it turns out that actually was a pretty good idea. And we all have experience where you go, a few years ago, someone says, hey, I'm going to go do this, right? Or the marketplace, you read an article in the Journal of the Times, you go, boy, that seems crazy. And 2 years later, it's crushing it, right? So the top left are what we call the inventor's curse, right? And you've all heard these apocryphal stories of somebody who tried for years and decades and hundreds of conversations, right? And eventually convinced people it was a good idea and eventually built a customer base, right? And those things absolutely do happen, but we tend to glorify this idea that once you have it, it's a good idea. It's just about trying harder. And that's not always the case, right? The second type of error is what we in the Graduate School of Management call the MBA's curse, right? These type 2 errors where you can find plenty of reasons to kill it, and whether they're analytical or otherwise, right? And you end up not pursuing an idea that actually is good. And so the real challenge for you, particularly as you're starting out, is this worth my time and energy, right? And often early in our careers, the horizon seems to go on forever, right? But as you think about the precious amount of time and energy you have, nobody wants to work on something that obviously is not going to turn into something. Conversely, if you've got a good idea, you really want to get it out into the marketplace. So we have 3 precepts we're going to cover in the next couple of minutes. The first is that moving forward means reducing your uncertainty. How do you figure out where you are on that matrix, right? Is this a good idea or not a good idea, right? And when we think about building that commitment, right, of reducing uncertainty and you're building a commitment, we think about it as a function of your vision. What's your vision quest? What are you trying to create? And then validating it with a series of experiments. So again, very simple chart, right? The vertical is the current worth of your idea. And don't think about it so much in venture capital terms of what would somebody pay to invest in it worth, but just the inherent value of it, right? And then the horizontal is the development of the idea over time, right? How are you going to progress? And classically, we think about things like this as some sort of linear or maybe a curvilinear relationship. The reality is that the way things happen is value actually moves in stair-step functions. And conversely, uncertainty moves in the opposite way, right? So what are these stair steps? What are these functions that drive value and reduce uncertainty? So what you think about it is you as an innovator, as an entrepreneur, right? The challenge that you're facing is think of what's my uncertainty? What do I not understand about the customer, about the technology, about whether there's a market for this, right? And then what am I going to do about it? How am I going to test? How am I going to build a test and test to determine whether that uncertainty goes right or left, is good or bad? And it's this cycle of thinking and doing ultimately that moves you forward early on in the development of your venture, right? So back to our simple commitment is vision and validation chart, right? And you think about your current worth, the vertical, and the development of the idea over time. It's this series of experiments of thinking and then doing. I think my customer will like this kind of experience in this kind of environment, and I do something to validate that, right? Is one example of what we're talking about. The second one is that precept that we want to talk about is a new venture is a series of experiments, right? So back to this think do process, right? Your goal is to identify and resolve the critical uncertainties you have about your idea quickly and cheaply, right? The sooner you do it and the less you have to invest, the better off ultimately you are. And that can be somewhat contra to what we sometimes hear in the marketplace, where companies raise tons of money before they really know if they have a market or a product, whatever, and then figure it out, right? And our argument is start and figure out the easy uncertainties first with the least amount of time and effort. If you can find out early on where you are in that 2x2 matrix, or at least have a pretty good indication with a little bit of money and a little bit of your time, that's a heck of a lot better than a lot of your time and a lot of your money. So we talk about this structure of a $5, $50, $500 test, right? So do the $5 test. Go have a cup of coffee with a potential customer before you do the $500 test of doing a Survey Monkey, before you do the $50,000 test of doing a panel with focus groups and whatnot, right? It's a very simple example. The idea is, how do you do the early test quickly and cheaply and determine, is there a path forward, and also inform what that path forward is likely to look like. And so your goal really is to reduce the most uncertainty with the least time, energy, and money invested, right? And make it progressive. Okay, I'm going to go, I think, a couple more slides, and then before we pause, before we go to talk about problems, I'm going to stop and take questions. Okay, so as you think about reducing uncertainty, right? One of the biggest challenges we see, and we've seen thousands of entrepreneurs and thousands of technologies, right, is this inaction, and sort of rooted in a deep psychological thing that have come from, well, humans, thousands of generations, and for others on the planet, millions of generations, right? Uncertainty tends to create inaction on our part. I don't know what to do. I don't know what my problem is. I don't know how to solve this, right? So how you move forward with this is create a set of assumptions. I believe this, right? And then a hypothesis. And then you go and you test it. And this simple process of starting with uncertainty, creating a set of assumptions, a hypothesis that you're going to test, and then actually testing it moves you from inaction to action. And it is as simple as that. Now, things and the technologies and the ideas you may be working on are very complicated, and they probably have a lot of uncertainties, right? So part of your challenge is to identify early on, what are the ones that are most important for me to figure out first, both to determine where I am on that 2x2, but also to start to build your commitment and ultimately the commitment of others, right? You're not going to do it alone, but if you're not committed, it's not possible you're going to get teammates to commit and customers and partners and investors to commit. So how do you move from inaction to action? And so one of the things to think about is, how do you set your early stage deliverables? What assumption and hypothesis do you have, right? And what are the $5, $50, $500, and yes, $5,000 tests? And these aren't literally 550 and 500. And I think given inflation, we may have to change them to 10, 100, et cetera, right? But literally a chart of saying, here's a set of assumptions around my market, around my business, around my technology that I need to go and test. What am I going to do to start testing them, right? You're really fundamentally answering the question for yourself first and others. And this is really important point. There'll be 3 points in this talk where I'm going to say, this is really important. All of it's important. This is really important. You have to answer the question, for this to work, what would have to be true? I'm going to say it again. For this to work, right? For this idea, this venture, this technology to work, to do what I want it to, what would have to be a true? What assumptions and hypotheses do I need to test? And ultimately, what do I learn from that, right? And then the last piece of this, so this is the second of the 3, right? Better to be specifically wrong than vaguely right. I'm going to say that one again too. Better to be specifically wrong than vaguely right. Why is that important? Well, we can convince ourselves vaguely of just about anything. This is a pretty good idea. I think people will like this. I think the technology will work, right? And we really like to confront no, or really like to confront failure, right? And of course, failure is a huge part of innovation and entrepreneurship, right? So specifically wrong means creating a very specific assumption, a hypothesis, and legitimately testing it to find out whether it is true or false. And then in learning that, move forward, make adjustments, or sometimes stop, right? But the specific assessment is really important. It's easy to convince yourself, I think this is a good idea. I think people will like it, right? As opposed to, I went out and talked to 100 possible customers and I clearly shared with them what I'm going to do. And 93 of them said, nah, that'll never work for me, right? That's good feedback. It's not feedback we necessarily welcome or feel great about, but it's good for you to be able to assess and cheaply and quickly figure out the path forward. Okay, and the last thing, the third of our three precepts, is a pitch document, right? Is the first $5 experiment. You can get your thoughts together and build them out clearly, right, with a pitch deck. And when we talk at the Institute about pitching, we think about it in, again, a sort of $5, $50, and $500 paradigm. The elevator pitch is the $5 paradigm, right? And this is a short articulation of your idea, right? The starting point for a conversation that you can use with internal and external audiences. And we do a whole workshop just on the elevator pitch. But at the end of the day, it's about what is it that you're offering, for who are you trying to serve, that why is it important for that person, that company, that entity to be served, and why is it an important problem to solve? Then second is the venture canvas, and there's lots of different variations of this. We have a very specific one we use, right? And at the center of the venture canvas is the problem to start. We're going to talk about that in a moment. The solution, what's your solution? And then the value proposition. What is important? Why will the customer value this, right? And then I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but on the right side, you've got market and partners, and on the left side, technologies, your model, team, milestones, and resources, right? This is an internal framework to help you organize all the pieces that ultimately are going to position you for success or position you to say, this isn't going to work, right? And it really is a great foundation for the last of pitching an idea, which is a 10-slide pitch deck. And there are literally, if you go into ChatGPT or Google, or wherever you get your information, and type in 10-slide pitch deck, I think you get about 117 trillion hits, right? There's lots of variations. One of the most common ones is the Y Combinator 10-slide pitch deck, which I like quite a bit. This is the Institute's. It has a lot of similarities to the Y Combinators, right? It is your first comprehensive prototype, talking about your pitch, what problem, solution, and value proposition you have, who you're targeting, how your technology works, what you're thinking about in terms of revenue and pricing, what the rough financial projections might look like, who you're competing against, what your milestones are in the near and midterm, what your team is like, and then a summary and sort of key action items going forward. So I'm going to stop and take initial questions before we go to the next portion of this. And as I do that, I'm going to drop into chat each of these three things. So I'm going to stop sharing. And then I am going to open chat, and bear with me for a moment because I don't have Nikki today. So it is just me. But I believe I am doing this correctly. And there we go. Okay, so so all three of those should be in the chat, and you can download them. And let me stop and see so far if there are any questions you have that I can address. And as I said at the beginning, questions are always the most valuable and for me anyway, interesting part of the workshops. And you can just unmute and speak. I don't think, there's only a handful of us here, so we don't need to raise hands. Okay, well, seeing none, I'm gonna continue on then. And shift to the problem. So one of the things we really want to emphasize, and this curriculum is part of a curriculum we teach in a 4-day entrepreneurship academy, a full day entrepreneurship academy, a inclusion in a number of our courses here at the Graduate School of Management. And so our goal here, of course, is just to give you a little bit of a taste for things we think will be helpful to you as you think about the little bang and the big bang. And I would argue, and I believe successfully, that first and foremost is understanding what problem you're solving, right? And I don't think it's unfair to say that a non-trivial percentage of the entrepreneurs that we work with, and we've worked with thousands over the last 10 to 15 years, come to us having worked for quite some time on a technology or an approach solution to something. And when we ask them what problem are you solving, really struggle to articulate that. And our argument for you is that you have to start with the problem. You have to understand what problem you're solving before you can move forward with anything else. And if you don't understand that, you're ultimately setting yourself up for failure. So what problem is it that you're solving? Can you articulate it, right? And then who has it and how badly? And I'm sorry to be a bit profane, but the classic example of of how badly is it a hangnail or am I bleeding from the neck, right? Because both of those are problems, but the how badly part is very different, right? And then importantly, how would you measure it? How would you measure this problem? Because if you can't measure it, right, then how do you demonstrate that you've solved it or improved it, right? How would you measure it? And so I suspect many of you've heard this quote before. People don't want a 1/4-inch drill, they want a 1/4-inch hole, right? It's not the tool they want necessarily, the drill, right? They want the result of the drill. And typically when I teach this module, it's a couple-hour module, and we get into a dialogue about do people really want 1/4-inch holes? I don't know how many of you in your home, apartment, wherever office have lots of 1/4-inch holes in the wall, but my guess is probably not many of you. And if you do, good on you, no problems, right? But this is a classic example of, we talk about marketing and the problem and everything. People use this statement all around, but do people really want 1/4-inch holes? You're not solving the problem of my walls don't have enough 1/4-inch holes in them, right? You're solving a different problem. I want to hang a picture of my daughter or my dog or my whatever, right? Or I want to put up shelves, right? So this is actually a statement that's used quite often that is well short of the actual problem that needs to be solved. And why is that important? Well, if you're optimizing for 1/4-inch holes, that's a very different problem than optimizing for hanging shelves or pictures or whatever else you might be trying to solve. So understanding the problem is really, really important. And I mean, really understanding what problem you're solving, specifically who has it and how badly do they have it, and then how would you measure that problem and your ability to solve it. So I think given the fun that we had with Poll Everywhere, well, you know what, let's give this a shot. So hopefully you're seeing on the screen, what problem are you seeking to solve? And it's the same pollev.com /JOED if you can't see the little QR code in the top right. So let's take a moment, and because it's always interesting to see what problem are you seeking to solve? You're also allowed, I guess, to text if you really want. Wow, Poll Everywhere is just having problems today. All right, we're back. You can also send a text. You can send a text to 37607. Apparently, I wouldn't recommend that. I've never done it. I'm not of the texting generation. There we go. Health gaps. I love it. Problem you're seeking is health gaps. I will do this as well. Since I am working Oh, I love it. I could use food that is delicious, fun, and high protein. So we've got health gaps, food and health issues, access to behavioral healthcare for pets, solving the problem of people needing food that is delicious and high protein, access to transcranial magnetic therapy for depression, creating enthusiasm for STEM early on for kids, and creating real life examples of engineering. Fantastic. I love it. Okay, so we're going to move on and talk about the solution. About your solution, right? Once you've defined a problem, you've got a good starting point, right? You want to define the work that you're proceeding, right? Specifically as a solution to the problem you've identified. And you want to be able to describe what are the primary benefits of your solution? How does it specifically address the problem, right? And ultimately, we hear sometimes, oh, no one's ever solved this problem before. That, in my experience, and it's fairly extensive, I didn't get the gray beard for nothing. That's not true, right? Every problem has some kind of a solution. It may be inadequate, it may be inaccessible, there may be a lot of things associated with it, right? So part of your defining the primary benefits to your solution is making clear how it is different from how someone who has that problem today could solve it, right? One of the challenges we see with folks, I'm sure you're familiar with this Maslow quote, to a child with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. To a child with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? Often we're working on some whiz-bang technology. It's this really cool thing. What can we do with it, right? I'm not going to tell you that that hasn't, over the course of history, resulted in things that solve problems. But it's definitely backwards, right? Starting with the problem and then figuring out how to best solve it is the path forward to most likely solving the problem and ultimately building something of value, right? If you got a hammer and you're looking for something to do with it, right? If you don't see a nail, well, a screw might work, right? The idea being that you convince yourself you've got this powerful technology or powerful solution without fundamentally understanding the problem, chances are good you're going to apply it to a problem that it's not well suited to solve. And then finally, the value proposition. And for those of you who aren't business students, it's like value proposition sounds like business speak. And it is a little bit, but actually it's a pretty good statement, right? It's really about how are they going to value what you're doing, right? What's the proposition for them that's going to create value? And specifically, you want to think about what's the most important benefit of your proposed solution. You should be able to articulate that. You got up in front of a customer, you're able to tell them right away, what is it about what you're doing that's really going to be important to them? And again, we very strongly urge you to think about, so how do you measure its value and why would they value it, right? And so back to the questions you were asking before of being better being specifically wrong than vaguely right. You can tell yourself, I'm pretty sure people that like coffee will like my new cool creamer, right? That, adds the flavor of milk without any calories. I just made that up on the spot. Sounds like a really bad idea, right? But sure, maybe. I don't know. That sounds conceptually good, right? You need to go and measure it, right? And make sure that, in fact, they would value it and that it's a measurable value. And so I said there were three really important statements, and I've already given you the first two. This is the third one, right? Do not walk away from this workshop without this in your mind. Start with the customer experience and work backward. What does the customer want? What is the customer value? How does the customer measure that value, right? Start with them and then build all the other pieces onto it, right? And again, it sounds pretty 101-ish. I would say fully half or more of the entrepreneurs and innovators that we work with really struggle with this. You get wrapped up in thinking about the technology or thinking about the market or thinking about strategic partners, and we can lose sight of the fundamental reason we're solving a problem, right, is the customer experience. Okay, so as we think about a call to action, and I'm going to stop in a moment and we will take additional questions and we will finish on time, right? Start thinking to yourself, what's it going to take to commit to move forward? What do you have to believe or what you're doing to commit, right? One of the fundamental things we teach in entrepreneurship, great course, great case, Origin Materials, John Bissell and Ryan Smith, two undergrads from the College of Engineering who started Origin Materials, right? And they were faced early on in their company's history with a little bit of fundraising and an interesting technology, and they were working on it on the weekends and in evenings, and everybody had jobs. And they came to a point where John, the CEO, said, we're either in or not, right? We're either committed to doing this and following it through to success or not. Because lack of commitment, we're never going to get there. We're never going to be able to get to the point where we can determine whether there is real value here or not. So what is it going to take you to commit to move forward or recognize you shouldn't commit, right? Both of those are viable outcomes. And I think, again, sometimes we think I've got this idea, I have to move forward with it. No, you have to determine, is there a there? Where are you on that 2x2 matrix? Is it worth pursuing? And how do you then pursue it? What are the uncertainties you have, right? Can you articulate them, particularly around customer, around market, around your technology? And then what experiments? Remember that simple little chart, right? Your assumption and hypotheses and your $550 and $500. What experiments do you need to conduct, and how do you prioritize the ones that are most important to conduct first? And then what is the problem you're trying to solve? And being able to articulate that very clearly and very specifically and something that is very measurable. And then what is the articulation of your solution, and how can you demonstrate that customers will value it? And again, better to be specifically wrong than vaguely right. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. And I know that was a tsunami of info in 32 minutes, 31 minutes and 30 seconds. But I am glad to have a conversation about anything that I presented, anything about the Little Bang, the Big Bang, our workshop series, how we teach innovation and entrepreneurship at the Institute, about my experience as an entrepreneur, anything you'll find helpful. I know it's lunchtime, so I suspect hopefully you're in a nice Zen-like spot, and you've got some questions. So I'll just open it up for anything y'all may have.
Thank you, Professor Joe, for all the information. I am in
De
the
nada, Federico.
and you can and yes, I am in the early stages, and I am still trying to figure out very well what is the problem that I am trying to solve. So, what is a good technique that maybe you can share, like how to find where to find the gaps, where to find probably the spaces where I can implement some kind of solution?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that, Federico. I would say there's different techniques to both find problems and then define them. Often it starts with the asking why, right? But I would say even going a step back from that, it's fundamentally understanding the nature of the process or the situation or the market, right? And I think there is sometimes an underemphasis in thinking about observations and expertise before you ever get to starting to really think about the problem. And let me give you one example. So another set of undergrads from UC Davis ultimately founded a company called Building Connected. And the problem that they were solving was that if you look at very large companies that want to build big projects, a giant new office building, a bridge, a tunnel, whatever it might be, right? They tend to be large companies. They tend to move around geographically, and they tend to hire a lot of subcontractors, mechanical, engineering, plumbing, all the things, right? The CEO, the founding CEO of Building Connected, started his career in the construction trades, ended up working at Bechtel, and over a period of a couple of years, observed that this was an incredibly inefficient marketplace. People had Excel spreadsheets, and there was no connectivity. There was no ability to create a marketplace where projects, general contractors, subcontractors could all meet, right? So without getting too much into the depth of that, it was the observation and living in that industry that made clear that not only is that a problem, but there is clearly no solution. And what's being used to solve it is incredibly inefficient and ineffective. And right. And that helped propel him to his commitment and then starting to build the company. So I'm not saying you have to be in the industry for multiple years to know it, but I want to sort of use an extreme example to show that that understanding of the fundamental problem was critical to then figuring out what was actually going to solve it. And I think sometimes we can get caught up in a little bit of knowledge. I'm not going to Dunning-Kruger, but that a little bit of knowledge can be a little bit dangerous. And I've heard entrepreneurs talk about, oh, not knowing the business is really helpful because I'm not tethered to existing solutions. I'm here to tell you, I personally don't buy that. I love the idea of not being tethered to existing solutions because that's how you come up with a new way of solving things. But I think our true understanding of what's the customer experience and what is the situation that they're in and what process do they have to go through helps you to ultimately define the problem, define those gaps, right? And then I think the second side of it is then, really getting it, articulating it in a way that it's a meaningful problem to solve. So it's not the holes in the wall, right? It's the building the shelves or the other things, right? Is engaging with customers. And in Big Bang, we require you to talk to 20 customers. If any of you are thinking about doing the I-Core, which we run through UC Davis's Venture Catalyst group here on campus, they require 100 customer interviews. And it's through those conversations that you really begin to get a codification of your assumptions. And one other thing I'll say, Federico, which I really appreciate your question, it gets to a core concept in my view of innovation and entrepreneurship, which is this idea of iteration and collaboration. And the reality is you're not going to figure it out the first time or the 10th time or probably even the 100th time, right? And you're not going to figure out it alone, right? You need to iterate and collaborate with people who know more about a particular subject than you or have expertise in marketing or technology, collaborating with customers, collaborating with strategic partners, distribution partners, whatever it is. That entrepreneurship is this process of iteration and collaboration over and over and over again. And it tends to be, I think sometimes we think about this eureka moment and like one giant bubble, right? And I liken it more to a string of pearls. It's a lot of really beautiful little bubbles, right? That string together that ultimately get you from an initial idea to a place where you could actually implement it.
Thank
Did that
you.
answer your question?
Yeah, very well defined. And I like the methodological part that you put, like step by step and getting involved.
Good. Awesome. Other questions? Don't be shy. Dana knows me well. I don't bite. And plus, it's virtual. I can't bite you. And my wife's a vet. I have my rabies vaccine. I'm good. My titer's high.
Hi, Joe. I'm
Shannon!
Hey.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing fabulously, my friend. Good to see you.
Great to see you too. I think I'm gonna do the little bang and bring in my bakery idea, but I was kind of thinking about like the customer calls. And I was wondering because in one of the classes they were like, if you were developing a pet device, go to Petco and stand there and kind of like talk to people as they're coming up to the same product that you want to sell. So like, what kind of engagement do you see the best from like in person versus calls versus like sheets, like Google Sheets send out kind of like what would you say is a really good idea to get feedback from the customer?
Boy, that's a really good question, Shannon. And I think you're not going to be surprised to hear the beginning of my answer, which is, of course, it depends, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it depends on where you are in your process. It depends on what you're trying to learn. And
Hmm.
it depends on sort of the nature of your product or service and where you are in the arc. So I think all of those are tools that you should consider using. I think early on, so let's start at the $5 test, really
Hmm.
is about starting those conversations with folks that have some level of relevancy. It's moving from inaction to action. That's the most important piece of it. So
Yeah,
finding
because I
the
think
perfect
mine would be
person in the,
parents technically
what's
too.
that?
Because I think mine would technically be parents I'm at first that I'd be
Right.
targeting.
Yeah, and so it's more about finding some folks that are relevant and having those initial conversations as opposed to worrying about is this the perfect person and the perfect question and the perfect
Yeah.
everything, right? Collaborate and iterate. As you progress, I do think it's helpful to be in a moment of truth, right? So I don't know that I buy the Petco example, though I don't diss it. But the that moment of truth when you're making a decision about how am I going to solve this problem is a good time to engage with someone because their head's in that space, right? So if you can get in an environment where they're making that decision, I do think that's
Okay.
helpful. I think there's some, puts and takes to something like that. I think some people can get there. I know that for some companies early on, simple Survey Monkey or simple questionnaires using friends and family, whatever, to just get some initial framing can be really helpful. What you're thinking about is, I think most important is how are you progressing along that 550, 500 sort of arc of getting smarter each time. So don't worry about, in fact, don't dive to the 500 one, do the 5 1 because that'll get you smarter for the 51 and so to answer your question imperfectly, I would start with a few conversations with people that you know have pets in that situation, right? And that may tell you, oh, okay, now I've got sort of really the most important questions and the phrasing of how to ask them. Now I'm going to send out a survey to
Okay.
25 people. And then based on that, oh, I've learned a little bit more. Now, all right, maybe I'm going to try some in-person,
Mm,
conversations, right? And so think about how do you progress in a rational way that each time you get smarter, you do that think do thing, you're in a better position to engage. But back to my first point, which is it is a lot about inaction to action. And we find,
yep.
especially for folks that I'm not trying to paint anybody with a broad brush, but maybe spend a lot of time in the lab or, sort of do a lot of solo work. It can feel daunting to go talk to a prospective customer, right?
Hmm.
And I can tell you, we have a lot of data on this, like a lot of data on this. The number of times that people that interview prospective customers have spontaneously combusted is zero. It's never happened. You're gonna be fine, right?
That's good to
And-
hear. That's good to
yeah, but
hear.
it's hard, right? Particularly some
Yeah.
of us, you know me well, but I like lean in. I love those conversations. I get energized, and some of us are more like, right? Right? You got to find your meter, right? Your comfort zone. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of people hesitate talking to customers, uh,
Hmm.
and they're missing out on a lot, and they're putting themselves at risk of going down a path and not knowing. And I will tell one more brief story, no names associated, but a few years ago, we had one of our entrepreneurship academies, this brilliant technical engineer developing a biomedical device. And he had been working on this thing for nearly 2 years. He had a functional prototype, and it was not a simple device. It invested a lot of time and energy and probably funds in it as well. And I know nothing about this field, right, from a technical standpoint, but I knew a little bit about process. And so I said, so what do customers think about this? And he said, I haven't talked to any yet.
Oh,
And I said, well, wait a minute, why? And he says, well, they're cardiac surgeons, and cardiac surgeons are really hard to get. And yep, they are really hard to get. To get 5 minutes with them, good luck, right? I said, but here's the thing, that's the conversation you have like day 6. you know, you're on day 500 at this point, right? You need to go
hmm.
have that conversation. And unfortunately, the story has, well, I don't know, that bad end, but it went and talked to them, and it turns out they're like, wow, this is really cool. Here's 3 reasons why it will never work. Like in my
Oh,
experience,
wow.
why it will literally never work.
Oh,
And I think this entrepreneur benefited a lot from the technology. He's gone on to a great, everything's fine, right? I mean, it wasn't like a horrible end story, but it's a perfect example of having those early conversations because you've got these assumptions in your mind you haven't really ever
hmm.
tested. He spent a lot of time on the technical ability of can I make it do this thing without asking the fundamental question, does the person I'm making for want to do this thing? Can they do this thing? Are there things, assumptions I'm making I don't understand, right?
Hmm.
Back to my Building Connected example with Dustin, the CEO, it's like, it's being there and understanding what
Hmm.
real problems are and what solutions could possibly work are really, really important.
Awesome.
So a more
Thank you.
complicated answer than you're looking, but
No,
18
it's
years as
all
an academic,
encompassing.
I can't give short answers anymore.
Nope. I love it. 1% better. We got it.
What other questions do you all have? Dana, you must have a question. You always have questions, Dana.
No, I mean, I don't. I just wanted to listen in to hear how you positioned it. Um, I just kind of am always in this perpetual, thought of this circular where what if, sorry, I think I'm probably frozen, but can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah. And
Okay,
where you're
yeah.
frozen looks perfectly fine. You don't look
Yeah, okay.
unnatural.
Um, just the thoughts around, I work with some students that have like really promising, technologies, but, where is the market for this? And is that, have you have the drill, but you don't have the hole. And so there's entire spaces.
Yep, we've lost you, Dana. Dana, if you can hear us, we've lost you. Well, we will hope to get Dana back. In the interim, any other questions that I can address on really any topic, including who's going to win the World Cup? Nobody wants to know who's going to win.
Okay, I have a question.
All right, June.
Thank you. I love this UC Davis series. It's the only second time I've been able to find it through Startup Sacramento, by the way.
Oh, great. We love our colleagues at Startup Sac.
Right. And I live in Eastern Washington and I really don't have access to a lot of help. Our startup community is not very deep for people who aren't techies or whatever. So, but I've been in it for like 14 years now, so it doesn't put me off. We just got to keep building it.
Uh-huh.
And so I needed to find peaches I couldn't find, and my husband's a potter, so I don't have a lot of I don't have expendable income where I can go down to Whole Foods and buy anything I want. I'm always looking for the best food at the best prices.
Sure.
Okay. So that the premise was I was looking for peaches that were basically affordable, that were organic, and that were local, so they were fresh. And I called all over and called farms, looked online for farms, and this was 5 years ago. And anyway, I ended up building organicnearby.com, which is basically an online farmers market. And I have this crazy idea where I wanted it to be like Facebook or Amazon, where you just click in and the stuff comes up. And you don't sign in, you don't have to have any accounts, and it connects you directly with the farmer. And it would be free for the farmer and free for the consumer. That is the premise of organicnearby.com. So I have a developer partner, a very good one who has a full-time job and volunteers to build this thing. And but it's basically me figuring this out to scale. And lately I came across Benjamin Hardy's book.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went, okay, I've got to scale. I love this mind-bending thought process of of focusing on one thing at a time, and floor focus, and I forget the other thing that he's got going there. And so I went to the floor of Organic Nearby. So I'm figuring out what is the floor of Organic Nearby. I'm in basically two communities, Sacramento and Eastern Washington. And and I have farms in both communities and their products on there. So I'm using AI as my teammate. I'm using ChatGPT, but I don't know if you know uh, Subhi Chatterai. His
Mhm.
name is Subi,
Sudi.
Sube, Subi.
Okay. Mhm.
Yeah. And he's the head of Google Startups. And I met him, showed him the website.
Uh-huh.
He loved it. Turns out, next time we messaged, he was just at a local farm with his family picking strawberries. This makes sense to everybody. But anyway, I'm using AI, and today I follow him on LinkedIn. He says, "Oh, you got to go to Gemini and all this." So I'm using ChatGPT. So I go to Gemini, and I'm like, "Okay," I put some of the same information in, and they have good suggestions. They're different than ChatGPT.
Sure. Yep. It's a different tool.
That's it. And I'm wondering, I don't want to I want to spend only the time that I need to in figuring out the floor, because you need to have the floor and before you can scale,
Right.
right? And so
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, and so in ChatGPT, I've been working with it for a year. So it really knows me. It knows my whole everything I've been doing for a year and asking it questions. I'm starting with Claude. And is there a framework I can use so that is it valuable to spend my time looking at a couple of different AIs to figure out the answers, or, um, and if it is, how, how do I effectively, categorize that so I can use that information simply? Because, like you can only accomplish 3 things in a day. That's it.
Sounds like a good day to me. Well,
I know.
yeah. Well, so a couple perspectives, and then I'll take it out a little bit broader, if that's okay. I think in general, I think about technologies. Let's go with with AI, whether it's Gemini or ChatGPT or Claude or whomever, as a collaborator, right? It's a source of feedback and insights and whatnot. And we would argue, especially early on, that a diverse set of collaborators is really important. If you're getting the same thing, like the same people you're pitching to, or the same people, you tend to go down a tunnel. I'm not saying it's impossible, but we strongly encourage our entrepreneurs early on, and Dana knows this from her experiences, to get a wide variety of perspectives. And then ultimately, it's going to be up to you to figure out how to incorporate that information. And let me give you one very targeted example. So as part of our Entrepreneurship Academy, we run speed dating. So midway through the Entrepreneurship Academy, we'll have 60 people in the academy. We'll bring in 60 regional entrepreneurs. They have marketing and finance and technology and all kinds of backgrounds, right? And we purposely don't do any matching where I'm interested in biotech, I'm going to give you a biotech mentor. We give you a variety of mentors. In the course of the evening, you talk to 6 different mentors for 15 minutes at a time. You pitch and you get your feedback. And these are all people that have had success, have perspectives, but they all have different success and different perspectives. And one of the challenges for the entrepreneur is they're going to hear 6 different reactions to what they're sharing, right? And they've got to take that and figure out what's core to me. What am I going to learn from that? What do I need to explore? What confirms something I believed I already knew? What calls into question, something that I think I know? So my encouragement to you, June, number one, what you're doing sounds really cool. So congrats on that. That's awesome.
I
I
know.
urge you to, think about that collaborative iterative process, particularly, as you're trying to make formative decisions. Breadth is important, and then you got to figure out, no, this one's valuable. And you may end up focusing on more narrow set of advisors, human advisors, artificial intelligence advisors. But I think, having that iteration of a broad set of folks is good.
I love that answer. That's a great answer because you made it human.
Well, I am not yet an AI, so I'm good.
I love it. Thank you so much.
You're
Yeah,
very welcome.
definitely.
All right, so we're going to wrap up because we're right at time. I am going to share my screen for one more moment. And just to remind you about our upcoming events. Upcoming workshop, I will be teaching the next one next Thursday, right at noon Pacific time on market, business, and technology validation. And then the following Thursday, January 29th at noon, my colleagues Joanna Siebert and Angela Lindley will be talking about narrative, how you tell your story. And then the following Thursday, I will be teaching a business module workshop on defining a sustainable enterprise. And then finally, in April, so quite some time from now, we'll do Pitching Like the Pro. We'll get into very detailed conversation about each element of the pitch deck. And then just as a reminder, Little Bang, if you want to participate, that deadline's coming up on February 5th. It will fill up before February 5th. So if you want to compete in Little Bang, I urge you to get your application in as soon as you can. And then Big Bang, there's no limit on applications there, but those are due on March 3rd. Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for your time. It was really great to have everyone and look forward to seeing you at our next workshop. Cheers.